The drilling began at 3 a.m., tearing through the silence and pulling me from a restless sleep. I jolted awake, my eyes flickering open to the thick, pitch-black humidity of my room, if I could even call it mine yet. Everything still felt wrong, foreign. The dim shapes of my nightstand and scattered books cast eerie shadows in the darkness. Beneath me, the muffled mechanical whirring continued, low and relentless. I threw off the damp sheets, which clung to me like a tangled web, and swung my legs over the side of the bed. My bare foot slammed into a box of unpacked picture frames, the sharp pain snapping me fully awake. The floor was a minefield of boxes and bins, silent evidence of my own procrastination. I hadn't even plugged in a lamp yet, so I groped my way in the dark toward the door. Downstairs, a harsh light spilled out into the hallway, glaring and unnatural. Every bulb seemed to be on the overhead lights, both lamps flanking the couch, even the television, its screen flickering with a muted rerun of Family Feud. The room felt too bright, almost surgical. My dad crouched by the front door, a drill clutched in his hand, sweat glistening on his face. He was securing a heavy-duty padlock to the doorframe, the drill whining as it bore into the wood. Tools lay scattered around him, sharp and haphazard, as if abandoned mid-motion. "Dad," I whispered. He whipped around, the drill clattering from his grip. His face twisted in a mixture of fear and surprise as he clutched his chest. "Jesus," he gasped, exhaling deeply. "You scared me half to death." He forced a shaky laugh, but something was wrong. His voice was edged with a nervous, jittery energy I had never heard before. "What are you doing?" I asked, wrapping my arms tightly around myself, a cold dread blooming in my stomach. "It's 3 in the morning." He glanced at his watch, eyes widening. "Is it that late?" He mumbled, half to himself. Another strange laugh, a high, nervous giggle that sent a chill down my spine. "I thought I'd add a lock," he muttered, his eyes flicking away from me. "You know, it's not safe here. This place hasn't been touched since the 70s. Anyone could break in." I raised an eyebrow, but he wouldn't meet my gaze. His hand shook as he rubbed at his face, fingers sliding over his thinning hair. Nearby, 2 empty beer bottles glinted under the blinding lights, and a third, half-finished, sat near the toolbox. "You should get some rest, Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even as unease twisted inside me. "No more drilling." Sure," he muttered, already turning back to his work, his bloodshot eyes fixed somewhere beyond me. "Good night." I crept back upstairs, my feet brushing against cold floorboards, and caught sight of my mom peeking out from their bedroom. Her face was pale, curls tangled around her face, her eyes wide and haunted. "Is he?" she asked, voice strained, but I only nodded. Her eyes held the same worry that gnawed at me, a worry that had grown ever since we moved here, like a dark cloud that hovered in every room. Since our arrival, Dad had been restless. He spent his nights pacing, muttering to himself, or scratching away in his notebook with a feverish intensity, something I'd never seen in him before. But now it was more than that. The conversation with my mom had been circling in my head for days. "He needs medication," she said firmly. "Ambien or something. Did you see what he did to the door? It's not natural to be up all night like that. He has to teach freshmen at 8 a.m. soon." Both my parents were English professors at the nearby college, one of the reasons we'd moved here. My mom was teaching afternoon and evening classes that summer, while my dad was supposed to have time he couldn't seem to fill. Fall semester was creeping closer, and his usual sharpness was dulled, replaced by a jittery tension. I had chalked it up to the anxiety of leaving the city, where he was used to noise, traffic, and people. Now we were the only house on a dead-end street, surrounded by trees that crowded in closer than I would have liked. After Mom left for class, I wandered the house, finding a new deadbolt and a heavy chain drilled into the front door. It was locked tight, every bolt secured, and then I noticed a thick, military-grade padlock at the bottom. I twisted each lock in disbelief, but the door wouldn't give. "Jesus, Dad," I whispered, bending down to inspect the lock, hoping to find a spare key somewhere. But there was nothing, not even on top of the doorframe. And there, on the floor, 2 pale scratches marred the wood, disappearing underneath the front door. Annoyance twisted into something colder as I crept upstairs, slipping into my parents' room. Dad was still snoring heavily. I grabbed his MacBook and carried it downstairs, hoping to find some clue as to what had him spiraling. I entered his password, my middle name and birthday, and pulled up the desktop. It was cluttered with old student files, vacation photos, and random, neatly labeled folders. But there were no recent projects. When I checked his browser history, something caught my eye. One article opened to a picture of a family, a couple with bright red hair and their 2 young, red-haired sons smiling at the camera in a holiday photo. The headline read, "Family of 4 found butchered inside home." I could barely breathe as I read. The father was found decapitated in the bedroom, his head resting a few feet from his body. The mother was discovered in the children's room, sprawled across one of the beds in a protective pose. One of the boys had been beneath her, hacked beyond recognition. The younger son was found in the bathroom, his small body torn apart, pieces scattered throughout the house. My hands shook as I clicked back, nausea creeping up my throat. My eyes darted over the screen, finding even more articles. A similar story appeared on another site, but this one had a video of neighbors standing in front of a home, draped in police tape. "They seemed like a nice family, but we didn't know them well," one woman repeated, her eyes wide with shock. "They'd only just moved in." The police chief was visibly disturbed as he spoke of the lack of leads, suspects, or even signs of forced entry. I clicked back, my horror mounting. It wasn't just this family. There was a mother and daughter found disemboweled in a farmhouse, a man found torn in half in his duplex, 3 brothers shredded in a locked room, a couple in bed savaged in what police called an animal attack. The list stretched on, each article more grotesque than the last. He lived on the 22nd floor of the apartment building, high enough that every shadow and creak seemed to echo through the walls. The articles I'd found were scattered across the country, but they all shared one horrific detail. Each victim had been a new resident, moving in only days before their brutal deaths. There were no suspects, no explanations, only bodies left behind. I must have read for hours, paralyzed as shadows stretched long across the room. The only light was the glow of the laptop screen, casting sickly blue shadows. My stomach turned with every grotesque detail, but I kept telling myself it had to be just research, notes for my dad's next writing project. And yet, something felt horribly, horribly wrong. "They'll be back tonight," a voice murmured, sending me bolting upright. It was Dad's voice, low and strained. He was standing at the bottom of the stairs, his face half hidden in shadow. Blue rings danced in my vision as I blinked at him, struggling to adjust to the dimness. Without a word, he moved into the kitchen, flicking on the overhead light, which seemed to bleed the shadows from the walls. His clothes were the same wrinkled ones he'd worn last night. I put down the laptop and followed him cautiously, watching as he opened the fridge and pulled out a beer. He popped the cap and took a long, desperate swig, his bloodshot eyes finally turning to me, soft and pained. "I didn't want to bring you into this," he said quietly. "Not yet." "What do you mean?" My voice was a trembling whisper. "They'll be back tonight." He looked down at the empty bottle. "I don't know what it is, but I think I know how it works. At least I think I do. Some things still don't make sense." His hand trembled as he reached for another beer, fingers clenching the neck of the bottle. "Ever since we moved here, I've been hearing these voices, horrible, inhuman voices, saying things that no living thing should say. I see them sometimes too." My heart pounded as I took a shaky step closer. "What do you see, Dad?" He opened his mouth to speak, but his face twisted in confusion, as if the words were too twisted, too dark to make sense. "You'll see for yourself soon enough," he muttered, downing the rest of his beer before staggering back into the living room. I was left alone in the cold, watching his shadow drift back into the darkness. By midnight, Dad and I were sitting together in the living room, hands wrapped around mugs of coffee, waiting. The clock on the wall seemed to tick slower, the minutes stretching into hours. Mom had brought us dinner earlier, some takeout burgers from the campus diner, and tried to talk to us. But she gave up after a few attempts, annoyed by our silence, and had gone to bed with a sigh, leaving Dad and me alone. In the dimness, the only sound was our breathing and the occasional groan of the building. I didn't know what we were waiting for, what we were hoping to see or hear. But I owed him one night to see where his delusions led before deciding what to do next. I checked my phone, scrolling through my feed without actually seeing any of it. The TV was off, and all I could hear was the relentless ticking of the clock. "How much longer?" I whispered. "It depends," Dad replied, voice low. "On what?" He paused. "I don't know." "Oh," I muttered dumbly, and the silence thickened. I must have dozed off in my chair, because when I opened my eyes again, it was nearly 2 a.m. Dad was shaking me, his voice a cold whisper. "Hey, wake up. It's here." "What's it?" I almost asked before the sinking dread reminded me of the twisted game I'd indulged him in. As my eyes adjusted, I saw the gleam of something in his hands, a shotgun, clenched tight. Where did you get that?" I nearly choked, my voice cracking. "Put that down." But Dad just crouched by the door, shotgun resting across his knees, his ear pressed to the wood, as if straining to hear something. "It's here," he whispered again, more to himself than to me, his eyes wide and wild. "Do you believe me now?" I sat up, my own pulse hammering, but I heard only silence, just the ticking of the clock and my heartbeat roaring in my ears. I strained to listen, hearing nothing, until I sighed and moved to stand up. "Come outside, Daddy," the voice hissed through the door. I froze, terror flooding through my veins as I registered it, a child's voice, soft and tremulous. I looked at Dad, my breath catching. "Daddy, I'm so cold. Please, come outside." The voice called again, but there was something wrong, like someone was struggling to mimic a child's voice. Underneath the high-pitched plea was a faint, gravelly echo. And something about it, it felt familiar, Dad. I whispered, inching closer, my eyes locked on the door. "Who is that? Who's talking to you?" Dad looked at me, his face a mask of sadness. "It's you. Daddy? Daddy, please, I need you." The hollow voice grew louder, right against the door, so close I could almost see the tiny mouth that must have pressed itself to the wood. The realization washed over me, sick and cold. That voice, it was mine. Or it sounded like me, a younger me. A voice from old, shaky VHS tapes, recordings from a childhood long gone. The lisp, the soft syllables I'd had before my teeth came in. It was so horribly familiar, but wrong. How is that possible? I whispered, but Dad didn't answer. He was lost in the trance of the other side, listening intently. "I know you're in there, Daddy," my voice called, imploring. "Why won't you come outside?" "It gets worse," Dad whispered, eyes darting over my shoulder. "Nathaniel?" The voice shifted suddenly, becoming my mother's. "Nathaniel, come outside, sweetie. I need you." My blood turned to ice. It was impossible. Mom was asleep upstairs, completely oblivious, like I had been, night after night. "Nathaniel," the voice demanded, harsher now, laced with a tone that my mother only used when I was a kid and in trouble. "It knows you're here," Dad whispered. "It always knows." "Nathaniel, listen to your mother," the voice snapped, growing guttural and strange. "Come outside, now." Something pounded on the door, rattling the locks in their frames. My father rose slowly, pumping the shotgun with a heavy, metallic snap. The door shook in its frame as if something massive was testing it, pushing, waiting ... "Nathaniel." The voice sing-songed, morphing into a deep, raspy snarl. an almost inhuman growl. Something began tapping on the door, a sickening rhythmic pattern of clicks, like nails running up and down, tapping in a horrible symphony. "Come outside, or we'll come in." I shrank back, scrambling across the floor, my eyes filling with tears as I pulled my knees to my chest, wrapping my arms tight around myself. "Make it stop," I pleaded, my voice breaking. "Dad, please, just make it stop." He aimed the gun at the door as the sounds outside grew louder. And then, after what felt like an eternity, they stopped. Silence hung heavy in the air, pressing in around us. My dad lowered the gun, his shoulders tight as he took a step closer to the door. He peered through the peephole and inexplicably lifted his hand, slowly unlocking the chain. "Stop," I called, my voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" "Don't worry," he said, though he looked far less sure than he sounded. "Everything's going to be okay." I watched in horror as he undid the deadbolt, then turned the doorknob. He fished a key from his pocket, slipping it into the padlock, and turned. In one slow, torturous moment, every single lock was gone. I wanted to scream, to beg him to stop, but I couldn't. My voice had deserted me. He pulled open the door, and I could feel the warm summer air spill inside, thick and unsettling. The porch light cast a feeble halo in the darkness, barely reaching beyond the threshold. There was no one there, but I felt her watching. I leaned around my dad, blinking into the blackness. Something was moving out there, slithering between the trees, a shape slipping in and out of sight like smoke. Only the faintest pinpricks of light betrayed it, blinking and shifting in the darkness. Its eyes, they glinted, catching the porch light, steady and calculating. Then, it started to scream. I clamped my hands over my ears, the sound slicing through me, hollow and sharp. I squeezed my eyes shut, expecting any second for the thing to charge at us, to rip the door from its hinges. But then, a slam. "It's okay," Dad murmured, crouching beside me, setting the gun down on the floor. He pulled my hands away from my ears, his own shaking slightly. "It can't come inside. I know that now. It can't get us." "But," I choked on the words, "we have to call the police. We have to get Mom and leave. We can't stay here. It's going to kill us." "We can't," he replied, voice grim. "That's what it wants. It wants us to go. It wants us to run. That's how it works." "I don't understand," I managed, trying to shake off the suffocating terror. "How do you know all this?" Dad sat back, his hand gripping my arm firmly. After that first night, I started digging into Record's old property files, anything I could find about the families who'd lived here. Every single one is dead. Whatever that thing is, it's been doing this for years. The house, it's a trap, but also a sanctuary. I don't know why, but I think as long as we stay here, we're safe. If we leave..." He trailed off, his gaze shifting to the door. I didn't need him to finish. I'd read enough. I'd seen what happened to the families who came before us. This was no nightmare. This was real. That was a few months ago. Dad told Mom after that night, though she didn't believe us at first. Not until we showed her. I don't think it's something you can understand until you hear it yourself. That voice, its voice, wearing your memories like a mask. Now she understands. We take shifts, keeping watch each night, trading off like guards. It needs an audience, you see. Last Tuesday, Dad felt safe enough to skip his shift, but it didn't like that ... He woke in the dead of night to the shrieking, the door pounding as if something was trying to beat it down. Frames shattered on the walls, glass everywhere, and locks scattered across the floor. Each picture swung from its nail, teetering on the edge. We won't make that mistake again. I once asked him why he bothered replacing the locks, knowing they wouldn't make a difference. He said it's more symbolic, maintaining a sense of control over something that leaves you helpless. I understand now. Just a few minutes ago, I turned each lock myself. It's my turn to keep watch. I grabbed the book and flicked on a rerun of some show I've seen 1,000 times. The noise, the flickering light, it makes me feel a little less alone. On good nights, I get a few hours of sleep. I can almost ignore it when it mimics my voice, but it's harder when I hear mom or dad. Worst of all, though, is when it speaks in something else's voice, something that sounds almost human, but not quite. Every so often, I catch glimpses of it, a silhouette pressed against the window, a shadow drifting under the door, or just black claws reaching, scratching at the floor. I don't know if it's possible to look it in the eyes, and I know I'll never try. The quiet presses in now. No crickets, no birds, not even the wind. Even the TV sounds dead somehow. And that's how I know. It'll be back tonight. It always comes, but so do we. I settle in, waiting, feeling its presence at the edge of the dark. I know you're in there, it whispers, low and hollow, just outside the door. I can hear you breathing,